भारत की ज्ञान परंपराएं, organized by Center of Excellence for Indian Knowledge System. I am extremely overwhelmed to get this opportunity to address you all on this brightest occasion of the conversation with Shri J. Sai Deepak ji and Professor Joy Sain sir. Dear friends, it is said by Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan that it is the intense spirituality of India and not only political structure or social organization that it has developed that has enabled it to resist the ravages of time and the accidents of history. Dear friends, some people say that India came into existence on 15th August 1947. What do you think? Is that true? Today we are going to answer such kind of questions. And in Rigveda says that Satya Notta Bhita Bhumihi Surya Notta Bhita Dayoho Ratenaditya Rishthanti Divi Somo Adhi Sharitaha. It means that truth is the base that bears the earth. By Surya are the heavens sustained. By law, the Aditya stand secure, and Soma hold his place in heaven. So, I request our guest, the truth speakers of this century, to assume their seat on the dais. Give a big round of applause for them. We have among us Shri J. Sai Deepak ji. Sir is an engineer turned lawyer, practicing as an arguing counsel primarily before the Supreme Court of India and the High Court of Delhi. A mechanical engineer from Anna University, he graduated with bachelor's degree in law from none other than our esteemed IIT Kharagpur Law School in 2009. And he carved a niche for himself as a litigator in civil, commercial, and constitutional matters. Over the years, he has been a part of several matters, such as the one relating to the Sabarimala Ayyappa temple, Sri Padmanabha Swami temple, and Basmati geographical indications. In 2019, Sir was awarded the Young Alumni Achievers Award by our IIT Kharagpur. Apart from delivering lectures on law, he is a prolific writer on constitutional issues from leading newspapers and magazines. We have among us Professor Joy Sain sir. Sir is chairperson of Center of Excellence for Indian Knowledge System. He is professor of architecture and regional planning. Sir has served as the former head of Ranbir and Chitra Gupta School of Infrastructure Design and Management, IIT Kharagpur, and then the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at IIT Kharagpur. We have among us the interviewers, Shri Purushottam. He is a student of IIT Kharagpur and PG representative of IIT Kharagpur. We have among us Digvijay Punia. He is a student of first year law. Now, the session will start, the session which we all are waiting for. Now, the arrows of questions will go on the speakers, our esteemed guest. I request, dear friends, to please come on stage.
Sadak Pranam. Before we start with the shooting of questions, I think we should felicitate our guests. Sarthak, I would like to.
Yes. Yes. Now I request Dr. Pankaj Gupta ji. He is a professor and executive director of OP Jindal Global University, Sonipat, to felicitate Shri J. Sai Deepak ji. We request Dr. Richa Vasudev Chopra ji, curator and principal coordinator of Bodhik Atmanirbharta, come faculty advisor of Center of Excellence Indian Knowledge System, Indian Knowledge Center, to felicitate Joy Sen sir. Over to you, Digvijay and Purushottam.
Thank you, Sarthak. Once again, Sadar Pranam to one and all, to my esteemed guests. Before we begin, so we want to talk a little about the book, India that is Bharat. So Shri Sai has already written another second version of that installment of that book, but we'll restrict our talks today to the first book. And so when I picked that book up, sir, already I had few thoughts about how the coloniality has impacted. But what I gained out of that book was that every third or fourth page I have marked a pen mark, like, okay, this is something that needs to be explored. So on that way, this book has been enlightening. Like everything seems to be very simple. Like even the basic constitution seems to be, we being students of law, the constitution seems to be a holy book that has been, like, if not came from heaven, but stalwarts like Dr. Ambedkar and all have prepared it. But once we go into your book and read it, then we realize it's the exercise. It's an exercise by some of our, let's say, intellectual people who were there. But then were they also, reminiscent of the problems that we might face now, or were they aware of the history? So was that history being put into that, is it visible in that constitution, or the articles of that constitution, or the polity that is being practiced today? So your book enlightens us about that. I am very thankful to you for writing it. And some of our questions will, the answers that we could not get, I hope I'll get them today through my questions. Thank you.
Professor Sen, your book, The Aryan Invasion That Never Was, was really intriguing in the sense that it had particularly captured the evidences that proved that Aryan invasion was a myth. And on this, we will be setting up the concept of how that book happened, and maybe you will be able to elucidate on getting the book on the ground level here. So yeah, Digvijay, we'll fire the questions.
Yeah. So my fundamental gripe, Shri Saiji, with your book, or my fundamental problem with your book, is that it talks about decoloniality. However, this entire exercise, I mean, is like looking back through the same tunnel that we got out of. We are looking through the same prism back. We are trying when we are reading that book, instead of, let's say, creating our own version of it. Say, for example, like it's like calling yourself non-left, reading yourself in the perspective of what already has been established. So why not then, like, use the terms like, say, the Renaissance, or the Enlightenment, or the Age of Discovery, which you have touched upon in your book also. So why use the term decoloniality or post-colonial deconstruction, and not use the terms, let's say, Age of Ancients, or Rise of Ancients, or the Eastern Awakening? So why did you choose it as a decoloniality, I mean, the terminology as such?
So, am I audible? Yes. For giving me an opportunity to, first of all, share space with Dr. Joy Sen. I think the last time we met was as part of the Vivek. I would like to understand a few rules of engagement here, because I don't want to start a controversy. what are the filters that it's something that you have to determine. And I'm assuming so in which case I hope that my not be, and what are the consequences of my free speech? I'm happy to bear. So let me start with the question first, and let me try and explain where I was coming from. I think it's a very fair question, which is that when you're looking at the concept of decoloniality, as opposed to going about looking at our history through an original Indic prism, why did you choose to apply a Western framework such as decoloniality? That's been your position. So, therefore, aren't you compounding the problem by framing the solution on the same lines as the problem? Now, the problem with the, or at least I'll tell you what my approach was. A society which is colonized, conscious of its colonization, is easier to deal with. But a society that denies the existence of a colonial consciousness or is unaware of its existence is a different beast altogether. Assuming for a moment discussion on ancient Bharat, I would have filter, which anyway happened, or other three direct consequences. One, somehow my own jati would have been the subject of discussion, saying that has influenced my thought process, which has been the allegation from certain academics sitting on both sides of the Atlantic who happen to be both of them accusing me of something which has some kind of a caste bias, which is exactly what I was trying to steer clear of. Second, it so happens that unless I perform the compare and contrast exercise between the very same exercise being undertaken in Latin American jurisdictions and a similar exercise being undertaken in Bharat, the reality or the unfortunate reality of the current situation is I wouldn't have had people consuming that particular material. Because the idea was to expose the dormant hypocrisy within Indian leaders, wherein they were or they remain open to ideas from the West on decolonization. But when the very same, let's say, exercise is undertaken in the context of Bharat, it somehow becomes some kind of a fascist exercise. And therefore, I wanted to confront that particular hypocrisy by placing first the Western framework on this particular subject in the first section and juxtaposing it with a similar exercise having been performed by Bharatiya scholars or at least scholars of theology, who may or may not be of Bharatiya origin, such as Jacob D. Root. And the idea was to say that you seem to be comfortable with the concept of decolonization when it's undertaken in the context of Africa, when it's undertaken in the context of Latin America, and you seem to be appalled at all the mass graves which are unearthed under schools where, let's say, indigenous peoples and their children were murdered, and they were found under. To show a similar example as far as Bharat is concerned, both in the past and the present, somehow I become the fascist. It seems to be purveying some kind of a politically incorrect truth. And so I decided to perform the exercise of first explaining. If you wish to understand colonization as a project, it makes very little sense to understand it purely from the perspective of Bharat. Look at it globally and then ask yourself, why would the European colonizers' attitude or behavior be any different as far as Bharat is concerned? If the consequence of his colonization is that it leaves Latin America Christianized, it leaves Canada Christianized, it leaves Australia Christianized, it leaves New Zealand Christianized, and somehow the moment he comes to Bharat, he apparently developed a secular conscience, and that we were the exception to his rule, without realizing that if we are around, and if this culture is still around, the credit cannot go to the benevolent nature of the colonizer, but must go to the inherent spiritual strength of this particular country and its civilization. And therefore, I wanted to confront it. And from there comes the second tangent. I wouldn't say a tangent, perhaps a sequitur or the corollary to that particular position, that if this happens to be one of those few societies which has managed to survive the ravages of a clear evangelical colonization experience, how do we still continue to wallow under the notion that this is a defeated society? And that is something that I wanted to push in terms of a very clear position. 3, a society such as ours will undergo 3 levels of analysis according to me. First is the awareness or the consciousness of the layers of coloniality that you're buried under. Second is a clear understanding of the extent of coloniality, which may vary from subject to subject. And 3 would be a prescription in terms of what is the way forward. So awareness, diagnosis, followed by prognosis or prescription. If I were to be engaging with a society which is already aware, I could have proceeded to steps 2 and 3 directly. But when I try and make lots of population in this country which continue to believe that we have not suffered any such thing or there are no unconscious or subconscious impacts of colonization whatsoever, I am still at step 1, where I am trying to convince and having to convince people that such an impact continues to exist. So if the consensus on step 1 has not been arrived at yet, where is the question of me moving to step 2 and step 3? Because then I'd be jumping the gun. So the idea was to lay out the problem identification, so to speak, from an perspective. That this is the nature of the problem, this is the quality of the problem, and this is the effect of the problem in multiple areas. At the very least, I have identified a few high-level verticals, such as caste, religion, identity, nature, so on and so forth, and environment, of course. And then said this is the impact of colonization. It is across the world. It just so happens that because of your resistance or your reactions, there is a change in the manner in which it has affected you. But the intention of the colonizer has been uniform and at the very least largely the same and broadly the same across the world. So I had no other option but to start with that particular mechanism. But perhaps a simpler example would be to draw from what Swami Vivekananda said. There would perhaps come an unfortunate time when Indians or Bharatiyas would find value in their own culture, when the Westerner repackages the very same culture and sends it to them saying, Tathastu, now read it. Right? So until Bharatiya knowledge comes from the Abhayahastam of the Westerner, we may not be open to it. So I said, well, finally, the colonizers' descendants themselves seem to be acknowledging the consequences of what their ancestors did. And yet somehow the victims and the descendants of the victims continue to wallow under the impression nothing has happened. So hence the nature of the approach.
In line with the question of coloniality and decoloniality, my question to Professor Sen is, what is this Aryan invasion theory? And why do you think it needs to be discussed in the current times? And how does it connect with coloniality?
Okay, a very good evening. First, at the outset, it's wonderful to sit next to Sai because this sitting is just not a frame on the stage. It talks about 2 generations, and I think there's a rising consciousness, from JS to JSD. Yeah, so, and I take this full opportunity to, because let's behave like IITians, it's a free stage. IIT ka tempo? That's it. That was Sai's post today. So I want to take a full blaze of that. And Sai has wonderfully set the stage, clarified the 3 steps. I'll make a small story, and I think this is a story which has gone through many eyes and reading here and there. It's about 1492. We call it the fall of Granada. 1492, the fall of Granada. There's a preceding 7 to 8 years, centuries of civilization in Europe, when the Moors,
the loosely called Arabs, or the Abbasid dynasty from the tip of Iran and Iraq was transferring the knowledge of Asia to the Cordova of Emirate. So all the knowledge, mathematics to culinary habits, the way you cook today in a kitchen, from tapestry to you compose a music, was getting transferred to West Europe. Till that point of time, you can check from history till about 13th, 14th century, Europe was never known as Europe. It was known as Andalusia, which means the end of Asia. So the tip of Iberia, Spain and Portugal, was known as And al-Usia, which means the end of Asia. So Asia Minor was India, China, Persia. Asia Major, Asia Major, I'm getting excited to sit next to Sai, so I'm making mistakes. And Asia Minor is Anatolia, that's Turkey. And it goes up to Italia, which is Italy, so they're bearing the same names. And then finally Andalusia, which is Iberia. What happened in the Judeo-Islamic line of civilization, there was a conflict which was also going with the other line of the three Semitic religions, which is the Judeo-Christian. And that was opening up crusades at both ends of Europe. One was Iberia, I'm making the story smaller, and one was Constantinople. So between 1453 to 1493, there was a change in the fulcrum. I mean, it's like a Libra. And what happened? The Islamic supremacy of Europe in the West went down, and it slipped out of the hands and went into the hand of the Frankish kings. And then the other thing happened on the side, which is Constantinople. The Christian supremacy in Byzantium went into the hand of the Ottoman Turks. This is the backdrop. And then the entire Christian civilization in Iberia, including France, sort of absorbed and downloaded the entire Oriental wisdom and developed a vocabulary of science, technology, culture, and everything. And then the expedition started, which was sponsored by Ferdinand and Isabelle, the coloniality, which is whole of size concern. And we have people like the Basques coming to India, which is Vasco, and the Vasco da Gama and Magellan. And there was one guy, a very interesting person, who read the Indian scripts and saw that the earth is not really flat, it's actually round. So he wanted to reach the Indies taking the western route. That's Christopher Columbus. And that's why we call the early Native Americans as Indians, and by mistake, and correcting the mistake, that today they are known as Red Indians. Now that's the whole story. So when 100 years fast forward, these people come to India, the Portuguese, the Jesuit monks on the Konkan coast, about 1590 onward till about 1620. They, in a series of about 10 to 15 years, started observing fantastic similarities between the words that they're brought in from Europe and that they find in India. I think you're all aware of it. Simple words like three, which means three, and khetra, which is a four square, which means four, quadro, and pancham, which is pentet. But very powerful words like the sarpa, which is a serpent, and then more scientific words like the jara, a three, which is the geriatrics, which is the science of old age, and asthi pathi, which becomes osteopathy, and so on and so on. And padhatri, which becomes pediatrics. So they're very worried, 16th, 17th century. And this worry had two branches. One was linguistics, and other was political economical. But they're looking for an answer. I'm making the brief very quick. And then they found out a very interesting word in the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, also partly in the Atharva Veda, but mostly in the Rig Veda, which is Arjo. And they saw different expressions of these special people with certain noble ideas, but having a bearing with colors of consciousness. which they interpreted to be skin colors, the colonial rulers. And when the colonial supremacy on Asia was gaining prominence, and the GDP of Asia as a whole, which was highest till about the 15th century, was collapsing, then the colonial rulers needed a theory, they needed a ism, they needed some kind of a package through which they could prove that about a few thousand years prior to the British and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Germans coming to the Orient, there probably one earlier branch of Caucasus people who had either come from Europe and waiting in the steppes, or from the steppes they had moved to Europe at some point of time, and they're pretty nomadic, pretty barbaric. But when they enter Iran, and particularly India, they all of a sudden become civilized. They start meditating, they start composing the sutras, and they formulate the language that they're speaking in the steppes, the Proto-Sanskrit, into a more formulated form of Sanskrit. And then some archaeologists like Montgomery Wheeler and others saw some archaeological evidence of some destruction in Indus Valley. And then they say this must be an invasion which was caused by the people coming from the steppes. So much before we are coming to the Orient and re-civilizing Asia, and particularly India, there is a history in the passage of time about 3,000 years back, and they had a very interesting time period based on the biblical Asher-Lightfoot chronology of about 5,000 BC and nothing before that, by calculating the years of the Bible. And so they had to package everything within 2000 BC because it coincided with the Greek civilization and the dates of Buddha and Confucius and Lao Tzu in China. And they forged, they manipulated, and they organized a very interesting theory of a group of people, a huge horde of people coming from the Caucasus and invading Asia. The Aryans by skin, the Aryans by genetics, the Aryan by apartheid, and Aryan by colonization. And this became the Aryan invasion theory. Now, why they did that? Because it had two advantages. One is they can distort the historic chronology of India and package the whole thing and contain the whole thing within 2000 BC. And the other thing is that they can create a pedagogy of education which is actually guided and streamlined by this Aryan invasion myth, and telling to the Bharatiyas, their Indians, that all that you have inherited from the past, whatever good and civilization has come from the steppes or from Europe or from the Rhineland, and all that possibly you have inherited from your own land is magic, superstition, and not of much science. So you need an education system which we are bringing right now, and this was broadly started by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Some of his speeches may not be true, but he definitely shuttled between India and the British Parliament a number of times, and he systematically reported the looseness of the Indian fabric, a land of assimilation. And it was taken up by a particular person in a very powerful way with the aid of Lord Cornwallis. His name was Randolph Winston Churchill. He was the father of Winston Churchill. So Randolph Churchill came to India and founded the missionary education on the one hand, and very systematically he started forming educational policies through which he started suppressing the traditional indigenous knowledge schools, the gurukuls of India. And as a branch of that, he brought in the missionary form of education to India. We're not speaking against the missionary system right here. What we are trying to say, it was not both. They were not complementary to each other. It was an either-or paradigm. Either you take the missionary system and survive, or you don't take and perish. So this was the whole game theory of the Aryan invasion myth and how it got into our Indian education system and how our basic books of mathematics and everything, so that all they could trace from the fall of Granada, whether it's mathematics, science, which could have gone from India to the Europe at certain later point of time, had actually come from Europe to India at a much earlier point of time. Hence, the Aryan invasion myth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sen. I think you summed up very well in very short. The moment we hear the word colonial, so the moment we hear the word colonial, the picture that comes to our head is of British or Europe or Europeans. Now, my problem with that word is that it restricts us to the European prism and somehow makes us forget the invasion, or what Sri Sai has referred to as Middle Eastern colony. So Sri Sai, how do you look at it that when you are referring to decolonization, are you only talking about the decolonization of Indian mind from the British impact or the European impact, or are you also looking at the Middle Eastern colony, the invasion? Because, and there is a second question, element to this question, because when we think of European colonialism, we think of economic repression generally. But when we think of Middle Eastern colonialism, we think of it as a bloody invasion and rather than an economic deprivation. So how do you look at it when you're referring to only as decoloniality and not as, say, invasion?
So, assuming for a moment that you apply the word colonization in a very broad sense, colonization is an end result. Invasion could be one of those means to achieve colonization. So, in that particular sense, I would apply the concept and the word of colonization both to the European experience as well as the pre-European Islamic experience. So, which is why in chapter 6 of the book, I've been very clear that it's going to be extremely difficult to discuss the layers of consciousness that Bharatiya consciousness is buried under without discussing both aspects. And why did I bring up both these aspects? Let me explain. So, in the context of Latin America, scholars who study the impact of colonization on Latin America have decided to ask themselves, okay, so what do we treat as the cutoff date to understand how did a pre-colonial Latin American experience look like? How did that particular society live? How do we make sense of it? Because you need some kind of a reference point, at least what let's call it a datum, on the basis of which you decide before and after. And therefore they said that the Colombian expedition to Latin America shall be treated as the reference point, which is to say the experience of the society and the manner in which it lived prior to the Colombian expedition and its consequences post that. Now that made a lot of sense in the context of Latin America, primarily because of its geographical location. There is perhaps, to the best of my knowledge, negligible history of any Islamic invasion of Latin America, right? And prior to the Colombian expedition, they lived in their natural state as indigenous societies and not exactly in the form of nation states as we understand it. Now, if I were to replicate the very same principle to the Bharatiya experience, it would be impossible for me to limit myself only to the experience of the European colonization. I would have to go much before that. Because the experience prior to European colonization also is significantly in the form of settler colonization. So there are 4 or 5 different categories of colonization that I've explained in the book, based on literature, of course. It's not my original contribution. So assume for a moment that one particular group chooses to use the other group or another territory primarily as a resource for assets, or as a territory for minerals or human resources or whatever it may be. Then it is plain and simple exploitative colonization. But settler colonization is when there is sufficient incentive for the colonizing group to settle in the colonized territory in significant numbers and take over not just its administration. One of the litmus tests to understand whether a particular colonization translates to settler colonization is if you decide to set up education systems, then it's a tertiary level of investment in the colonized society, wherein you choose to recast the colonized society in the mold of the colonizing society using education as the process. Which is to say, I don't limit myself to physical or political colonization, but I want you to think like me. I want you to dress like me. I want you to speak like me. And I want you to think in the very same language as me. Which unfortunately Indians take a lot of pride in when they say that today I think in English, right? So that means that project has been accomplished, mission accomplished. And then to the extent that you go to the next step, that not only do you start thinking like me, you also try and sever all relations with your ancestors, your pitris and your past. That is such a serious consequence for a philosophy that is based on a lot of pitri worship, on ancestor worship. So therefore, you're expected to spit on your past, think like the colonizer. That is the level of investment of a settler colonizer, which is exactly what happened with Bharat. Now, there is a reason why I would specifically apply this to all the Delhi sultanates followed by the Mughal, let's say, dynasty. Because prior to that, what happened? 7th century or rather 8th century, Muhammad bin Qasim comes, loots and goes away. So he is at best a looter, a plunderer and an invader of the, not even of the Alexandrian variety. Because he is not trying to establish a kingdom here. His intent is to loot, plunder, take the resource and go back. Now after the invasion of Sindh, it takes about 3 centuries for the Arabs and let's say the now fallen Afghanis who've now become from the Shahi Hindus, they've now become Muslims. For them to start crossing to this side. Which is why 10th, 11th century with Muhammad Ghori becomes the most important, let's say, timeline, so to speak. The Battle of Dharmo becomes the most important landmark. Because that effectively starts the establishment of a dynasty here. Starts with the Mamluks, the Khiljis, so on and so forth. And then finally, of course, the Mughal dynasty. So the establishment of a sultanate with, let's say, your administration, your epicenters here, your capital here and all of that is a significant departure from the Arab looting. That's very, very different, right? So that effectively takes the form and shape and color and texture of settler colonization. So therefore, although in principle, according to, if I were to apply the logic of Latin America, I should be saying that around 10th century is what I would treat as the benchmark for Bharat to start understanding how we were before that. However, the Arab invasion of Sindh effectively translates to seizure of Sindh as a significant portion of the territory. What we associate as portions of Afghanistan or let's say even parts of Khorasan or Persia that you see today. Okay, let me do a sample poll here. How many of you believe whenever you have seen the map of undivided Bharat or Akhand Bharat, do you see Afghanistan anywhere in the picture? Right, you don't. But until the Mauryan period, this was a part of undivided Bharat. So imagine that even in popular consciousness, you have given up on Afghanistan as part of undivided Bharat. It's not as if you have Pakistan today. It's not as if you have POK today. But your aspiration is someday this is undivided Bharat, at least some portions of it. But even in that aspiration, Afghanistan pictures nowhere in it. See, imagine how much you've given up. And when we speak of Bharat and when you look at archaeological evidence and whatnot, frankly speaking, while the Bhumi that we currently live in is certainly with that mothership or the lodestone or the epicenter, the actual expanse of Bharatiya culture is unimaginable. It goes right until Central Asia, where at one point, Turkish emperors used to call their Chakravartis with the title Dasharatha. The title given to the emperors of Turkic lineage was Dasharatha. The appropriation of certain characters in history by certain groups or identities is unbelievable. Genghis Khan was not a Muslim for the better part of his life. He wasn't. The man was a practicing Buddhist. He was hated by followers of the one single unique God. So this is how much we understand of history, unfortunately. So I decided to treat, at the very least, 8th century as the cutoff point. As the cutoff point to understand how would a pre-colonial Bharat look like. Now that's where the argument gets slightly complicated. I'm so sorry, I'm just taking some time here, because people might say, Hare, then what do you make of Kanishka? What do you make of all these people who've come from Chinese tribes and so on and so forth? What you need to understand is, prior to the Abrahamic faiths occupying center stage, we are not saying that invasions did not take place. We are not saying that wars did not take place. All we are saying is that for the better part of it, polytheistic faiths have conquered perhaps for wealth, have conquered for material resources, but not for imposition of faith systems. That is the primary distinction. And second, Kanishka, who may have been, let's say, of some kind of Chinese origin, is seen as part of our culture, because it is a concept of assimilation, where at some stage there is some kind of samanjasya here, where you decide that let's reconcile here, because he is not under any dying divine obligation, or he has not been ordained to impose his faith on anybody else. And consequently, in the absence of that scriptural injunction, there is no human obligation to do that. But when there is a scriptural injunction, along with a divine incentive with about 72 raisins, right, then obviously the entire equation changes. So which is why I've treated that particular period, notwithstanding all the assimilations and invasions, as the primary period to identify what is a post-colonial and a pre-colonial Bharat, how does it look and feel and smell. Now 2, I have dedicated only some portion of the 6th chapter of the first book to this, but I've expanded on that significantly in the second book, given its origins in terms of thinking, theology, political theology, what is the concept of a caliphate, and therefore what is the origin of the two-nation theory, so on and so forth. That I've built in the second book. Now why is this important? It's impossible for us to understand the Bharati experience without making sense of both these massive waves of settler colonization. Okay, what are the two major agriculture seasons in Bharat? Are Rabi and Kharif Indian words? Where have they come from? Right. So is Tehsil an Indian word? Is Zila an Indian word? Is Taluk an Indian word? Hare bhai, but Urdu is Indian. Why do you say it's not an Indian word? Thank you for answering the question. So therefore the point is, look at the impact of all of this on language. It has made a difference to your language. It has made a difference to your agriculture calendar and seasons. You go to Delhi courts, or most of the courts in the northern part of the country. Naib Tehsil, Ahmad, these are the names of different posts in the lower judiciary. Now this is obviously coming from the Persianized Turkic Mughal experience, right? So when you look at such deep impacts, pointing out these impacts itself creates a lot of problem, because people are wondering, if we spell it out, is there bound to be a cancel culture that I invite? Right? So that goes back to the first question, that I had to take a slightly indirect approach to feed the very same uncomfortable truth. Because you see, medicine is bitter and stomachs are weak. So I had to prepare the stomach a bit. Bache thoda muh khol lo, right? This is great food. It's come from McDonald's. Eat it first. But McDonald's ke andar I put some idli, right? And I said, this is Mac idli, because without the Mac you won't eat the idli, because you'll frown on the idli. So I'll give it as Mac idli. At least that way you'll eat the damn idli, right? So that's how I've decided to feed them. So I am very clear that to understand the British experience exclusively as economic repression is typical Shashi Tharoor school of argument, which I reject. That I've taken a very clear position on. Because it's surprising that you believe that these people were mere traders. Then what do you make of all the missionaries who came with them right from the very first visit? What do you make of the Konkan experience with respect to the destruction of temples? What do you make of the Mylapore temple? And why are so many churches established? Let's ask these basic questions. Who established this? Now the second thing is, again when we speak of the colonial experience, the other selectivity, so when it comes to the first colonized experience, which is the closest, you treat it as economic, you leave religion out of it. The worser aspect of your analysis is the experience preceding that is not even treated as colonization. It doesn't even figure in a discussion on colonization. That's even more blinkered and pixelated completely. It's completely airbrushed. Because whenever we think of the Mughals, we start thinking of Amitabh Bachchan's voice in Jodha Akbar, where he starts saying, Mughal yahan pe aaye, Bharat ko nawaza, yahan pe baith gaye, ye lutere nahi the. A settler colonizer is being given credit for not being an invader or a looter. Imagine the problem with that entire principle. Someone who decides to stay here, occupy your home, is treated as being better than someone who loots and runs away. You see the vikruti in this consciousness? So therefore I had to say, bhaiya, isme to itne sare partein lage hain, ek ek ko nikalna padega, I'll have to unpeel the onion gradually. I hope that's the answer to the question that was put. It's not a lawyer's answer to evade the question.
I hope that's answered in your second book.
Very bluntly, as candidly as possible, no punches held back, no holds barred, but within the bounds of civility and constitution.
So maybe we'd like to have another session on second book.
One interesting nugget. So the first book invited a lot of anger from a lot of people. Our own framework of decoloniality is now being applied in the context of Bharat. We never thought this would happen because serious attempts were made to keep this entire framework outside the Bharatiya discourse for at least 4 to 5 decades. This framework has been in existence at least since 1989, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's when the movement started in Latin America, when they started understanding why is the rest of the world caught in this crossfire between the Soviet bloc and the capitalist bloc? Don't we have an independent existence of our own? So that's when the question starts. Somehow, that scholarship never comes to Bharat at all. All sorts of woke garbage comes to Bharat. But that which is relevant to Bharat never enters Bharat. Right? And here's the interesting part. It's been August 23rd is when the second book was released. It's well past the 3-month mark. Not a single person from the other side has fired a bullet so far. Not one bullet fired yet. I said, okay, like they did to Vikram Sampath, somebody will accuse me of plagiarism. Wo nahi hua. Because I said, bhai, IP ka vakil hu, I know my subject. Right? I am a product of Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law. Very proud product of that. So you can't catch me on plagiarism, attribution, right? Footnoting. No, you can't. Sorry. I know the Western game very well when it comes to this. Imagine intellectual property and the principles of intellectual integrity are being taught to the rest of the world by the traditional looter of the world, which is the Western colonizer. He goes about telling the rest of us, this is how footnoting is supposed to be done. This is how documentation is supposed to be done. Because you see, a thief needs to keep notes of how much he's stolen from the rest of the world, no? That's why. Second, well, I brought my legal training to fore, which is to say, evidence, 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 document, document, document. This is what he says, this is what he says. Their only accusation has been, अरे primary source को इतना extract करके रखा है, पढ़ने में बहुत मुश्किल हो रही है. How much have you extracted the primary source is such a dry read. This is to ensure that you don't accuse me of selective extraction. This is to ensure that you don't say that my fascist tendencies are apparently, let's say, helping me meet some confirmation bias, where I'm presenting facts to suit a particular ideology. No, I've taken away all those arguments. And the best part is I've cited their own material. Now, if at all you have a problem, you should have a problem with the material that you guys have produced, right? So, what I'm trying to tell you is, it's one thing to discuss facts, but I'm trying to expose the politics surrounding the discussion of facts. which is a different argument altogether. Assume for a moment you and I were fighting on the nuts and bolts of a particular factual nugget, on historical evidence. That's a different issue altogether. But now, the fight is on whether I have the right to present my position in the first place. It's not even a question of whether my fact is right. It's on the ability to present that fact before the audience. Fortunately, those gates have been blasted open. They will never be shut again.
Shri Sai Deepak ji and Professor Joy Sen, both of you have emphasized on first principles in your talks. Could you share how first principles can be used in the reinterpretation of Indus Valley civilization as well as decolonization?
First principles, I mean, after all, we don't know what the principles are, and what are the first principles. I think first principle is something which is high up in the sky. We need to clarify a lot of things which remains here on the ground. And I just refer back to what Sai was saying. We are not very clear about your geographical space. Sai was talking about Akhand Bharat, the geographical space. You are familiar with the word sthan? Sthan? What does it mean? A place, a region, some kind of a geographical scape having some kind of a climate, some anthropology and everything. Look at the map of Asia. Hindustan, Pakistan, Registan, Rajasthan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and finally Turkestan, which shows Indian civilization existed definitely up to Turkestan. Is there a history book which has a map on this? Has any scholar in India paid 5 minutes of time to draft a drawing on this and show it in some history book? Yes or no? No. Why? Why? Because we are afraid. Because we are not very aware of the first principles. We don't know what these first principles are. When the colonial rulers come and tell Aryans by race, Aryan by skin colors, we simply accept them. There was a scientist born in India, one of the disciples of J.C. Bose, very renowned scientist, and he ridiculed and said, "Oh, Ved mein kya hai? Sab kya Ved mein hota hai?" He ridiculed. And somebody in Shantiniketan, you know where Shantiniketan is? It's a township or a satellite ashram founded by Gurudev Rabindranath. Somebody asked him, "Have you read the Vedas?" And he became furious, as if he didn't have to read the Vedas for a single time and yet comment on the Vedas. This is Indian academics of sciences, So we are not clear about our own principles, We make comments and think we are scientific. Do you know what is the definition of science? Do I know what is the definition of science? What is the definition of science? Anyone here? What is the definition of science? Just science means experimentation, observation, and inference? Is that all of it? Yeah. Is science only reasoning? Reasoning what? Evaluated ideas? Fine. I'll make it short because we have a time constraint. Science means that there is a first principle far, far away, which is like an ocean. We are not aware of it. But some people have created a path because he is a chemist. And through chemistry, he has created a river of consciousness, and he's exploring the metals and the compounds. And he's trying to find out that one metal from which all the metals have been created. In other words, he's trying to find out that one unity in this world of chemistry. Same is it physics. What is the physicist doing? He's trying to find out that one force from where this entire universe has been created. What is an yogi doing? He's trying to find out that one principle from which this entire cosmos has been revealed. Isn't it? So if you take a subset of all this set, what is common? And this is what Swami Vivekananda had said in the Parliament of Religion. The first speech, he said, "Je jathamang prapantadde tang sthaive bhajamaham mama vartanu vartanta pasha manushya sarvasha," which means Hey Arjun, whoever in whatever, look at these lines of Gita, whoever in whatever space, in whatever time, and in whatever context have approached the truth, either personally or approached me personally in different times, finally lead to me, lead to thee. This is Vijnana. This is science. This is the first principle. So if you're a man of science, if you're a man of science, if you're an woman of science, let's be gender free. If you're an woman of science, you'll never ever ridicule any other person without knowing what he or she is doing. So what Richard Feynman or Werner Heisenberg is trying to explore in the external laboratory of machines, mathematics, and algorithm, our rishis have explored that same truth for thousands of years in the internal laboratory of human mind. And this is where, when Swami Vivekananda became famous after the Parliament of Religions, we have any idea who are the bunch of peoples who are interested to meet him? Any idea? They are not men of religion, they are men of science. It was scientist Nikola Tesla. It was Lord Kelvin. It was Hermann Helmholtz. They are the people, they were most anxious to meet him. Why? Because in that man, they could see a very special peculiarity about Indian religion, which is just not religion or organized institutional religion. It is spirituality, where there exists the first principle of being and becoming. So, you become what you believe. When I'm talking about a child on the road, I'm just talking about the child without having any idea about where the child is from, which family, what is his language, what is his economic level, where does he belong to. But when the mother talks about the child, she speaks with all the knowledge, the biological knowledge of the child itself. Is it clear to all of you? So that means the internal conception of the child has become the external ideas of the child itself. This is Indian spirituality. This is the first principle. This is the first person inquiry which Richardi and many other sages of India talk about again and again. And this is what had fascinated a man called Werner Heisenberg. And in 1929, he's from Germany, and we have someone from Germany here. And Heisenberg, you know, he came all the way from Germany to Kolkata Science Congress to meet Tagore. And he just simply asked a question, poet, these very lines that you have spoken, we have found all of that after doing so many computations and so many analytics and working with whatever machines that had existed at that point of time when Heisenberg was there. How could you write these poetries which has become the lines of Gitanjali? How could you rhythm the truths of the cosmos and almost say the same things? I'll just recite a poem. He said, Shimar Maji Ashim to me. Within the finite, there is the infinite. Within the little boy, there is the whole family. Within the yogi, there is the vast divinity. Within one range of the Himalaya, if I touch that, I touch the whole of the Himalaya. If I go to Haridwar and touch Mother Ganga, I touch the whole of Ganga. I don't have to run from Gangotri to Ganga Sagar to get a whole idea of reductionist view of the Ganga itself. This is the greatness of this country. And this is the first principle. And this is the first principle which has been talked about by our Vedic sages who have said so beautifully. And it vibrates even today. Ekam sad bipra bahuda vadanti. There is only one truth. But that truth is infinite, impersonal, universal. But that is only manifested in various ways. Of which one of the most earliest expression is Hinduism, whose mother is the Vedic religious idols, from where flew a much later religion, which is a principle of Zarathustra, which is a portion of the Atharva Veda. And it is from the Atharva Veda, it finally decomposed into the three Semitic religions of Judaism, and then Islam on this side of the Red Sea, and Christianity on the other side of the Red Sea. If you say that, and if you bring that truth, then the power to proselytize, the power to convert does not remain. So you have to suppress the first principle, and you have to forge an Aryan invasion myth and make them look very superior, so that when they come to India, we fall at their feet and we become a slave of the third principle. We become a slave of the third principle. I just put it in my way so that what exactly is the first principle, it becomes clear. So this is a protest which is forwarded by all the great sages of India. I'll just name a few. I think one person who stands behind this book is Sri Aurobindo, And Aurobindo is probably the first person in the history of humankind who had the guts, who had the temper, who had the academic, Gnostic, and the spiritual knowledge to fast forward the first principle through his book, The Secret of the Vedas. So in this book, there is an annexure. I was so happy about Sai talking his book, which gave me a permission to talk about my book also. So there's a fourth annexure, which is on the secret of the Vedas. So when you look at the secret of the Vedas, you understand that the word Arya or Arjo is by the quality of mind. So from the material mind, which is tamasic, you're becoming a more active mind, which is rajasic. And from there, you're becoming a contemplative or a more refined mind, which is swatic. And the swatic mind just gives you the first machineries or the first principles to transcend the first principle and go behind the three gunas, which is tama, raja, and swatta. And then you reach the highest level, which is self-actualization. And that takes us, on the one hand, to Sri Aurobindo's hierarchy of minds, and also takes us to a brilliant idea which has been propagated by a great transpersonal psychologist. His name is Abraham Maslow, the hierarchy of needs. Through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the secrets of the Vedas have been unfolded. The first principles have been unfolded. So today a time has come when, as Sai has used the Western quotation to actually defend his own ideas, a time has come to very intelligently select all these wonderful works actually been done by the Western scholars in a beautiful way, through which you can recover the first principles of being and becoming. Thank you.
Can I just add to what Sir has just said? See, there are two ways in which you can look at this entire issue, broadly. One, think of this as a narrow-minded, parochial, identity-related battle. Or you go a step further, and as students of this great institution, understand what is called as the geopolitics of knowledge. Which is to say, there is a fact. Now, knowledge is not just about knowing about that particular fact, but also the manner in which you look at that particular fact. It is the lens that you wear. Now, why is this important? Today, when we speak of reason, logic, scientific temper, so on and so forth, these are all aspects which have been cast in a particular mold. And any idea that refuses to fit in that particular template is rejected as irrational, unscientific, and even worse, superstitious. There's a beautiful recent podcast. How many people watch the podcast of Joe Rogan? Please do watch. There's a very recent podcast where he's discussed the history of several ancient civilizations with a British archaeologist who goes on to say that once you realize that there have existed several civilizations during each of these ice ages, and we know very little, you'll be forced to recalibrate the timeline of human civilization entirely. And not just that, the worst mistake that we keep doing when we try and deconstruct or try to understand how the pyramid was built, or how, for that matter, let's give a Bharati example, the Brihadishwara temple was built. You're trying to apply your contemporary understanding of physics and civil engineering to what would have happened then, without asking yourself whether this paradigm of science, which we take for granted today, is the paradigm of science that would have existed then. So therefore, what do you ask yourself? For this to have happened, there should have been multiple elephants which should have rolled each of these boulders through logs, and it should have gone to this particular height. That is you applying contemporary thinking based on your assumption that a certain technology did not exist in the past, and you're retrofitting your current understanding of science to the past, without asking yourself, what if they have approached this entire problem in a very different way, which perhaps even militates your contemporary understanding of science. The reason why this becomes very, very crucial, and this is where I think the real battle is Indic knowledge systems, Indian knowledge systems constantly have to fight the battle of having to prove themselves on the anvils of Western understanding of science. So what happens then is you're forced to even look at this particular scientific approach, or let's say our contributions through the Western lens, which would be equally bad, because it's almost as if you're saying that when I indigenize Indian scientific literature, all I'm doing is translating something that has existed into Indian languages without asking whether this is the manner in which they should be approached in the first place. Each of our philosophical darshanas, each of the Shad darshanas have their own implications on how we have taken it forward in the form of science and technology. And therefore, it may be impossible to even make sense of Indian scientific contributions as long as the Western paradigm is applied to it. Now, the mistake that you're going to make as part of this discussion is to say, science is science, isme Western kya hai, Indian kya hai? No, not at all. Completely wrong. The manner in which you have a particular philosophy is the reason why you arrive at the concept of Shunya. The way you understand your relationship with the Supreme Consciousness, your place in the entire cosmos, is the reason that you decide to come with a particular concept called Shunya. It has got everything to do with your way of life. It's got everything to do with the philosophy that you believe in. It's got everything to do with how you see the Supreme Consciousness. So when someone says science is science, there are two, let's say, problems with it. One, it completely ignores the anthropological, evolutionary and cultural aspects of science. Completely. And the second thing that it does is that it treats one particular template as universal. And therefore it submerges everything else under the carpet. Finished. That's the end of the matter. So that means you will never look at Ayurveda on its own terms. Ayurveda will have to prove itself on the anvils of allopathic empirical evidence. So therefore, clinical trial studies, so on and so forth, the way you look at how a molecule is developed in traditional, let's say in Western pharmaceutical science, is the model that you choose to superimpose on Ayurveda without asking whether this is right. Is this fair? Because you have told yourself, if it's a quality standard, this is the benchmark. If it's an empirical standard, this is the benchmark. If there is rigor, this is the benchmark. There ends the discussion after that. So perhaps when you look at all these workshops which are happening under the umbrella of IKS, the first thing is not the content or the substance, but the manner of seeing, the manner of approaching, the mode of learning. That is the radical change that is required, which is to say, it's a complete rewiring. And you can't rewire unless you unlearn. The problem with unlearning is your existing set of realities will be upset. Placements affect हो जाएंगे, MS affect हो जाएगा, नौकरी चला जाएगा. आप स्टैनफोर्ड में जाके IKS की बात पक्का कर सकते हैं. Take it from me. It's just that you can't tell this to your own colleague here. That is the difference. You will be able to speak of IKS in a foreign country with the confidence. You know why? Because currently white guilt translates to them having to accommodate diversity. They're scared of the label of xenophobia and racism. And they're, मान लो भाई, वरना पता नहीं कहाँ से racist का tag लग जाएगा. Right? But in this country, you won't be able to do it. Because the moment you open your mouth, so a few days ago, I was told, I don't wish to take names here because how much more controversial can I get? So I'll just keep it as simple as possible. So, a dear friend of mine, Ami Ganatra, who's written this book on Mahabharata and Ramayana, is on the campus. One distinguished gentleman didn't know who she was or what she does. And apparently she was asked to introduce herself, and she was introduced as the author of these two books. In this day and age, who writes a book on Ramayana and Mahabharata? And this is from a person of Indian extraction, Indian origin, who's done well for himself outside this country. And then she had to throw her qualifications at him. I'm a product of IIM Ahmedabad, this and that and all that. Only then, then it must have some meaning to it. Until then, Ramayana and Mahabharata have no value until the tag of IIM Ahmedabad goes along with it, you see. That is the problem, and that proves the central thesis of my book of coloniality, which is you are not even willing to look at your own scripture on its own merits unless the tag of an organization which was set up in post-independent Bharat is associated with something that is at the very least 5,000 years old. What Mera Bharat Mahan, I don't understand. I think this is where you have to start decolonializing yourself. The battle is about knowledge. The battle is about whether I have equal breathing space on the negotiating table when there is a discussion on philosophy, on political culture, on economics, on science, on rationality, on reason, logic, temper, so on and so forth. I still don't have an equal space because I am expected to go through the very same success and failure model of the West. The West will do something, they'll say, oh, this is great, we'll say, this is great. Then they'll realize, oh, this was a complete failure, then we'll come back to the very same failure. So the rest of the world has no other option but to follow the West in all its trial and errors. So they have the power of ideation, we are the empirical data, period.
That was very philosophical. So after the philosophical side, it's time to get the glimpse of Delhi ka Vakil Sai, I think. Shall we be getting into law related questions? Do you want to see that avatar? Yeah, this is the last question that we are putting forward, and then we'll open for Q&A for the audience. So, Sai, we have seen that in our current constitution, it is basically about protecting the individual rights, or it's giving the primacy to the individual rights. And the only group rights that it tries to protect is of minority rights or the linguistic minority rights. However, in a civilizational state, it is more about group rights, and I think you also talk about it in your book. So how do you see that raising a civilizational state or reimagining a civilization state is possible within the current constitutional framework, or do you think we need a different a larger amendment or a different constitution? Number one. Second, that since these are group rights and all, similarly British having a similar kind of conformity makes sense because they had to rule, but Indian constitution having more diversity wouldn't, and in that light, how would you talk on UCC in the same light? So these two questions. Okay.
So I think a confession is in order, which is from the first book to the second book, my learning curve has been significant. So which is why my own positions with respect to the constitution have changed significantly from the first book to the second book. Therefore, I will not spell out any kind of prescriptions with a certain degree of certainty or certitude until I'm done with the exercise. And the exercise will be done in the 75th year of the Republic, which is 2025. Therefore, I will hold back the answer on that. But I have made a few tentative suggestions in the first book. So let me try and give the context to the listeners here so that they get a clear picture of what we are saying. So assume for a moment that you live in a largely homogeneous society in terms of race, language and religion. And you're looking at the concept of a nation state in Europe post the Westphalian Treaty. And therefore you have Catholic states, you have Protestant states. Within Protestant states you have Lutheran states, Calvinist states, so on and so forth. And therefore the hold of Catholic Christianity on Christendom is loosened, and you have more than one acceptable official denomination now, which is Protestantism and Catholicism. Now in that particular light, you have Protestant states and Catholic states. And then you have linguistic identities within each of these territories. So given that degree of homogeneity, there is no particular group which needs to protect itself because it's largely a similar identity. Then you're for the, let's say the basic component of the population becomes the individual. 100 people exist in a room. 100 people come from the same racial stock, the same religious denomination, speak the same language. No one person needs to protect the existence of his language against the rest of the 99 people. Right? Now, out of those 100 people, assuming 10 people come from a slightly different racial stock, speak a different language, then is the concept of minority rights, where European states effectively say, as a state we are Catholic or Protestant, but we will protect the rights of these denominational minorities. That's how the majority-minority discussion started as part of European discourse. Now let's go a step further. Think of it as Bharat. Every 10th person comes from a slightly different linguistic background. Plus, since it's part of the Sanatan Dharmic fold, every 10th person has a different sampradaya. Although within the same Sanatana Dharma, think of it as 108 denominations within the Dharmic fold. And each sampradaya is a self-sufficient or a self-contained code in itself, which is to say that sampradaya is capable of replacing the whole for that particular community. Therefore, that sampradaya is Hindu Dharma for them. They don't need to go beyond that sampradaya for their spiritual solace, material solace, or communal solace, so on and so forth. Now, in which case, every 10 persons would want to protect their identity against the rest of the 9 groups. Right? When you're looking at that kind of diversity, then it's no more the individual who becomes the basic unit, it becomes each group. Because each group is trying to protect itself against the other group. So that there is no imposition of language, there is no imposition of sampradaya, so on and so forth. Vaishnavites don't want any imposition by Shaivites. Then Shaktas don't want imposition by the Vaishnavites and the Shaivites. All of this happens. So therefore, when you look at a civilizational state, this particular portion of my book, maybe I could have written better, but this is the most misunderstood or mischievously understood by quite a set of people, because they've understood this to say that I am basically arguing for a communist kind of experience where individual rights shall be submerged at the altar of group rights. That's not my position. My position is, in contrast to a homogeneous nation state, in a civilization state there is multiple, or let's say there is greater diversity, and therefore there are more number of groups. So in a nation state, the state can be preoccupied with individual rights. But in a civilizational state where there is more diversity, the primary preoccupation will be the group right. And therefore what I've said is, in a civilizational state, the state has 2 obligations: protecting group rights as well as protecting individual rights. And where there is a conflict between the individual right and the group right, the group is going to say, If out of 10 people in a particular group, one person says, I will dilute the identity of the group, you're not just endangering your position, you're endangering the position of the rest of us in this group with the rest of the community. And therefore, in such a situation, that individual's right will have to give way to that particular group's right. Otherwise, it ends up becoming, let's say, they end up losing their identity. I'll give you a very clear example. Where is this entire argument coming from? From the Sabarimala experience. Think of Sabarimala as one particular sampradaya. One person says that an established tradition for 1,000 years, I will change because my individual right must prevail over the rights of the tradition and the rest of the community and that particular sampradaya. And that person doesn't even say in the petition that he or she is a believer in the deity. Why should you have access to a particular place of worship if you're not a believer in that particular deity? Can you enter a cinema theater without hoping to abide by the rules of the cinema theater? No, you can't. You can do whatever you want when you're watching a movie in the confines of your home. But when you choose to enter a public place, you have to respect the rights of everybody else. Now, I am saying if that applies to a cinema theater, are you telling me that the very same rights do not apply in the context of a religious institution which has sanctity, which has notions of purity? Of course, religious institutions have the right to maintain notions of purity. If it offends your sentiments can take a hike. Doesn't matter. If a place of worship cannot have the right to preserve its purity, which place will have the right to preserve its purity? Basic questions. Some halls, I am told here, have rules that you can't walk into the messes with shorts, you have to wear trousers. You can preserve your tradition with respect to walking into a mess, but believers don't have the right to preserve what is so sacred to that energy space. Look at the argument. So in that context, I said, if it is the conflict between one individual's right of access to that particular temple, if you're a believer, you will not question the tradition, you will subscribe by the rules. If you're not a believer, you don't have any skin in the game. You have no locus standi to argue at all in the first place. You cannot have access to that particular place. In such a situation, the right of that particular sampradaya and its followers will prevail over the rights of that particular individual. That is the context in which I made that statement. It is not meant to stifle individual dignity. It is not meant to stifle basic freedoms or fundamental freedoms of the individual. But the calculus will change from a nation state to a civilization state. Which is why I said, Bharat cannot subscribe to principles of nation statism which apply to European states. And European states today cannot afford to stick to their own principles of nation statism thanks to multicultural identities even within Europe today. So they have to reevaluate everything. And Bharat has always had to live with this reality because that's the lived experience of Bharat. So in that context, I would therefore say, as long as you try and look at Bharat through the experience of Europe, language identities will suffer, regional identities will suffer, linguistic diversity will suffer, cultural diversity will suffer, sampradayic diversity will suffer, everything will suffer. So that cannot happen. Second, a civilizational state ideally should not have only 26 languages in its constitution and cannot have only 2 languages for its business transaction. Terrible. What message are you sending to everybody else? Right? So, I genuinely believe that Bharat's constitution is the product of a multiple personality disorder. Which is to say, 2 people, or let's say people with their legs in 2 different boats, who are straddling 2 different boats, are the ones when they draft, they transmit the consciousness onto the document also. So in the second book, I've come out all guns blazing, explaining the dual consciousness. So one of the tallest leaders of the so-called movement around that period, can I take the time? May I? Yeah. Is now called Rakshitaha on official website and all that, I don't, is Surendranath Banerjee, who's a product of Bengal. Now Surendranath Banerjee had such serious pride in his origins as a Kuleen Brahman from Bengali extraction, and also goes on to say that I am a patriot of the first order of the British Empire. and that Bharat's destiny and its future success is contingent on Bharat riding on the coattails of Britain and being a part of the English Empire. Look at the compartmentalization in those headspaces then. Very comfortably saying, this is my origin and this is my allegiance. That means the direct impact of colonization is creating a cognitive dissonance in the minds of the colonized society, where you're unable to see the conflict between the two identities that you subscribe to and you think you can reconcile. Now, if that is the product, let's say, and he lived in the early 1900s, 1835 is the first minute where English education is introduced in Bharat. So 1835 to 1900, you're looking at 65 years. After 65 years, if this is the experience, are you surprised in 2022 the experience is even worse? In 65 years, that's roughly 2.5 generations, this is the product. So by 1947, what do you think would have been the case? By 2000, what would have been the case? By 2022, what would have been the case? No wonder you need to sell Ramayana Mahabharata with I am Ahmedabad. Right? So, I am therefore of the very clear view that the constitution needs a hit reset from a very different perspective. Most questions are, can we reduce the length of the constitution? Why do we have so many amendments? These are stupid questions according to me, fundamentally stupid questions. The question is whether the approach to this particular concept has Bharatiyata in it. Does it partake from our philosophies when it comes to, let's say, politics, so on and so forth? What was the reference point? For Article 14, you're looking at Amendment 14 of the US Constitution. Then for Uniform Civil Code, you're looking at somewhere else. The Irish Constitution becomes the reference point for Bharat. French Constitution becomes the reference point for Bharat. Czechoslovakian Constitution becomes the reference point of Bharat. Smallest of republics, which are not even the size of Kerala, I'm so sorry to speak, are going to be the reference point for Bharat. So my entire question is, when they were looking at this, did they refer to any Shastras, any Dharma Sutras, any works which spoke of our philosophy? If not, the independent slave has continued to build a state using the tools of the master.
I think that deserves a very good round of applause. We can now open the floor for Q&A. I'm sure a lot of you would have questions. Sarthak, can you take the mic if somebody is asking a question? I think your desk mics would also work.
Yes.
Namaste, sir. Sir, my name is NC Sahit. I'm from Hyderabad. There has been a spurge of energy in the country regarding the revival of Indian culture. Let me call it as Bharatiya Sanskriti. So this Sanskriti is nothing without Sanskrit. But the elimination of Sanskrit, which was not even possible by the foreign invaders, which we have done in the name of modernity and advancement, seems irrevocable. Today, even the mother languages are at threat. So how will Sanskrit come back? How will India come back? Is it inevitable that we, with our ignorance and mental slavery to the West, lose such a great scientific language like Sanskrit, the great literary, spiritual, scientific heritage of India? Is it not possible before I die that I see a few youngsters here at IIT Kharagpur discussing some science in Sanskrit? Thank you, sir.
So there is a slight problem with the framing of the question. Sanskrit will live. The question is whether it will live in Bharat. Okay. Sanskrit will live because the global thief has understood the value of Sanskrit long ago. He has set up chairs in all these Western institutions precisely for this, to start the process of co-option, to start the process of adoption, to effectively what I would call baptism, which is to take it away gradually. That process is long started. Aryan invasion theory that Sir spoke of is part of that entire philosophy. So you have to realize how this mind works. This mind is basically saying, if I find something of value in your culture, which is capable of universal application, I will first take away your right to lay claim on it. And therefore, its pitrutva, its paternity will be mine. Says the father of intellectual property principles. Right? Attribution, जो हमें सिखाने के लिए आते हैं, this is how they go about it. Why is that? Nothing of value should ever be traceable to your culture. Right? And even if it does, you should not have the right to claim it as your own. Hence the process of secularization of arts, the process of secularization of Bharatiya traditions, whatnot. That's exactly how it works. So don't be worried for the existence of Sanskrit. It will live. It is Deva Bhasha, it can't die. Whether it will live in the land of Devas is the question. And therefore, as a realist optimist, a question coming from a student of IIT Kharagpur such as this would have been impossible and unimaginable perhaps a decade ago. Right? I couldn't have left this room without let's say, a slew of allegations against me, given my answers. Nobody would have dared to publish my books. Okay? That means the window has shifted. Now that window has shifted to two things. Shraddhanjali to all those people who died unheard after doing their best. Over the last 70 years, they were not fighting an outsider, they were fighting an insider-outsider. So our first job as dharmics is to recognize the contributions of the greats of the past. And then count your blessings that you're fortunate to live in that particular window of history where you can see this transition happening, which is why I'm so excited that this is going to be the battleground generation. We are at a crossroads. So you're looking at literally this is Arya Parkiladai. If this 25-year window from now onwards, effectively I would say 2019, I wouldn't even say 2014, 2019 onwards, roughly by 2047, if Bharat regains its ability to confidently assert its roots and which doesn't translate to exclusion of any kind, but a firm, confident assertion of the self, I think the job is done for the better part of it. So I am very confident of one thing, that the right questions are being asked. There is hunger for the right kind of content, operative word being right. And therefore, I am not someone who's pessimistic about the future. That said, I understand the lay of the land in terms of the challenges ahead. It must come to a point that when you're dealing with a pandemic, you don't force Ayurvedic practitioners and their diagnosis to be sent to an allopathic practitioner for a second opinion. The day you have the confidence that even during a pandemic, your indigenous medicine systems are capable of doing the job, as opposed to treating them as the stepney, that day I would say is when Bharat has truly arrived. Because until then it is only symbolism. Until then it's only symbolism. You will talk about history, you will talk about temples, important, absolutely important, no problem. But when it comes to practical application of it in a way where it affects economics, where it affects health, do you have the confidence to walk the talk and the courage of your conviction that this will see us through? China had the confidence to do that with respect to Chinese medicine systems after having exported that beautiful virus to the rest of the world. Bharat did not have the confidence. It was a fantastic opportunity to mainstream Ayush. Ayurveda should have been at the forefront of it. I spoke to quite a few practitioners around that particular period. They were like, I am a second-grade practitioner in this country where my prescription will now go to an allopathic practitioner for vetting. Would that be acceptable to any other stream of profession? I don't think so. That's exactly where the challenge is. So don't look at it only from the perspective of language. I would say language is important, but even when it comes to downright application related issues, do you have the confidence? I would say we are still not there. We are going in that particular direction. I genuinely hope that IKS gradually starts not just producing literature from an archival perspective, which is important because that's where we are at this point to understand what existed. But then it translates to very serious application of those knowledge systems and those thought processes and modes of sensing and understanding to contemporary problems. How do you apply that logic to policy making from the perspective of sustainable development? How do you apply that from the perspective of this growth-based market development? Can Bharat sustain this beyond a point? These are questions which I'm sorry to say Western models do not have the answer to, because they are not based on contentment, they are based on perpetual growth, and they are based on rampant consumption. And in the process, it will leave this particular, let's say this planet, completely sucked dry of its resources, incapable of existence after a point. Then we'll all have to look to Elon Musk to give us the next vehicle to go to Mars, which I don't think is a very responsible thing to do. So I am saying your micro question and the macro issue are related. So I think maybe in the next 5 or 6 years, people like me, our work may become obsolete, because then the discussion would have moved from the politics of the issue to the issue itself, which is what is the necessity. At this point, we are gatekeepers, we are Dwarapalas, trying to protect the people who are doing their jobs. The hope is when the people doing their jobs get center stage and our jobs are done, over. The purpose of existence is complete, over.
Maybe we can take the next question.
Is it simply an exercise of inclusivity, or is it for the socio-economic development of the other? Because, I mean, in my view, today's world, I think it is the former and not the latter.
You think it's more about inclusion, is it?
It has become that.
Okay.
Which should be about the latter.
So my own views on the subject have evolved significantly from 2015 onwards. And that is because of greater reading. I don't think it's going to be possible to have a very honest conversation on reservations unless the history of caste-based prejudice is discussed upfront in this country. And how much of it is fabrication and how much of it is based in lived experience. Both of that need to be understood. I repeat this and I say this very consciously, I am never going to use decoloniality as a framework to brush any mistakes under the carpet. I'm not for that even one bit. However, when I know for a fact that a Claudius Buchanan goes about demonizing Sati and the Jagannath Yatra to solicit missionary contributions from UK to say that we have to save this heathen land from its own heathen religion, I will then ask myself, if this gentleman and this thought process has a tendency to exaggerate stuff in Bharat, are we saying that the very same tendency to exaggerate wouldn't have applied itself in other areas? That's a question to be asked. Look at Bharat as a subcontinent with such huge diversity. Realistically speaking, caste equations are not the same across the country because dominant groups differ from one part of the country to another. It's different between Bihar and Bengal, which are, at one point, they were part of the same administrative unit. It's different within Bihar, it's different within Bengal, it's different between Tamil Nadu and Kerala, so on and so forth. So why do we have such a monolithic, monochromatic view of caste equations when it comes to Bharat? Such a huge country. Language and its dialect changes every 10 kilometers. Practices would have changed. So I think first of all, it's a matter of huge research, which is why I will keep my position very tentative. Something which requires more research, I wouldn't want to shoot my mouth off on. That's one. I'm only on what needs to be done. Two, at some stage, I've said this, even if you disagree with the principle of reservation and its existence, realpolitik tells you that there is no way that you can take away a particular facility without creating a replacement for it, because public has become used to it, right? And now it is not limited to any particular varg or group. Everybody wants a share in this pie, and the pie is only limited. So you have to ask yourself, do you want a larger share in this particular pie at the expense of the overall quality of goods and services that we provide as a society? Ask yourself that question. Generally. Two, what is the replacement possible? I have said very clearly that freeing temple resources from state control and earmarking a portion of its revenues and proceeds to address the very same classes which are the subject of reservation schemes will do two things. One, achieve inclusion in that central institution, which is the nerve center of your identity as a civilization, which is the temple. Address the problem. Second, I believe that there is an inherent barometer in this country. No wonder when there is a call for giving up of certain subsidies, a lot of people said, here we are willing to do it, provided the right person asks it. And there are wonderful examples from the south, especially in Tamil Nadu, which has the highest degree of reservation today, 69%, where communities which have been treated as SCs have clearly come forward and said, we don't want to be treated as SCs anymore. And that's old news. It's at least 2 years old. So there are people here who are capable of thinking beyond these narrow problems. And therefore, I would say, create the right set of atmospherics. Inclusion and representation will go hand in hand along with development. And there I would certainly want to use the temple as the pivotal entity for getting the job done here. In countries like Germany, and I'm sure I can be corrected here, the church plays a very important role in partnering with the state in provision of certain civic services. Okay? The church is not seen as an organ which is completely free or independent of any kind of public, let's say, facility provision. And interestingly, this is also the product of European secularism, where it doesn't take away the Christian identity of the state, by the way. Only in Bharat, secularism translates to taking away Hindu identity of Bharat. All Christian states and all European states have a very clear Christian identity, one way or the other. They have some church, the Anglican church or the Lutheran church, so on and so forth. It's only in Bharat, secularism means give up your identity. Okay? I've explained this in the first book. So if that happens, the state can look at perhaps the largest possible NGO, which is the temple, which has networks all of the country, to partner in provision of certain services. If you had freed the temple and given it the freedom that it deserves, it could have helped you significantly during the pandemic also, of its own volition. So I'm saying that freeing the temple from state control holds the key to unlock several of our issues and address a lot of our problems, including the issue of reservation. It's possible, I certainly believe it's possible. Any other discussion you see is fraught with a lot of political calculation, and no government, regardless of its ideology, will have the guts to undo what it has already done. In fact, it will only make it worse. Because caste arithmetic, despite our so-called positions against casteism, is fundamental to our electoral arithmetic. Those who say that let's do away with caste should first do it away as far as their electoral arithmetic is concerned and then pontificate to the rest of the society. If they don't do that, they don't have the right to tell us what to do. When tickets are being handed out for elections, if caste plays a role, then you don't get to tell the rest of the society that let's do away with caste, because that's pure, empty, symbolic rhetoric. It has no practical application. And whether you like it or not, you have not been able to do away with the social structure whatsoever. You've tried your best, you've failed miserably, you've only entrenched it further. Then you might as well know how to use it to coalesce and forge the society as opposed to breaking it. So to answer your question, I believe offer a replacement to the existing system and make a move in that particular direction, then it's possible to have a better conversation. Then the thing is, then you'll have a conversation which is at the very least more honest. Now the conversation will start with stereotypes, labels, allegations, rhetoric and whatnot. And then you'll have all sorts of legislations coming to picture which will fetter us from even speaking. So, not easy. Next.
I think, do you like to continue? I think we are past our time. Okay.
And in the interest of diversity, because I'm a misogynist, I think someone should speak. I think a lady must be given an opportunity to ask a question. Sure. Otherwise, thanks to my Sabarimala track record, I'll be told he doesn't let women speak. Yeah.
Sir, this is Aditya Aman, your junior from law school. I'm a final year student now. Few minutes back, you were talking about the norms of wearing shorts in some halls. So I would like to tell you that right now we have abolished that thing. We are very vocal with our rights and we ensure that the hall authorities answer our questions regularly. My question is that, sir, few days back there was a controversy which was related to a piece of cloth which is related to female, and a particular group of people, religious group of people, tried to symbolize that with their religion. So do you think that is it an outcome of colonial mindset which they try to impose on others in the name of...
Let's do two things. Knowing me, I don't run away from any question. But I leave it to the organizers. Do you want me to answer this question? And two, does the audience want me to answer the question? Now, Bhukto, your consequence. Live streaming is going on? Okay, so the moderator has applied a slightly different filter here. So, bahar baat karte hain. Okay? Yeah.
So
try and stick to the theme as much as possible, please. Yeah.
So this is about funding of Christian missionaries for conversion, particularly. So I read about the FCRA law.
Right.
And I'm not a law student, so I don't understand what exactly it implies. But what is the scenario right now, and what are the methods that you would suggest to stop the flow of illegal funds to these missionaries?
So when FCRA was being discussed several years ago, I had the opportunity to work on it very briefly as part of giving certain comments for a particular group. But beyond that, there is a serious paucity of knowledge on my part to be able to comment on it beyond that. Okay, so I want to place that caveat on record, because as lawyers, people think that we are capable of speaking on every aspect of every law. No, we are not. It's as bad or as good as asking a urologist to speak on something related to heart. Okay, so I'm not going to do that. I have a slightly different take on this, and you have to consider this. So what happens is, you're trying to address the means as opposed to addressing the end goal, which is you're effectively addressing all the means and methods through which conversion is achieved, as opposed to taking a very clear conscious position on the issue of conversion itself at a national level. And you're running away from this particular question. As perhaps one of the few surviving indigenous, pagan, heathen civilizations, you don't seem to have the right to take a position against conversion. That is a reflection of the lopsided nature of the discourse today. And apparently, constitutional freedoms and constitutionalism can be used to subvert civilizational identity itself. That seems to be the argument, which is the document will be alive, but the civilization will be dead. Operation successful, patient dead. Right? That is exactly why the purpose of my exercise through the book is to say that the book that you do this Ashtanga Namaskar before is meant to protect what remains of this civilization. But somehow we are intent on protecting the book at the expense of the civilization. And any talk of civilization invites all sorts of ad hominem allegations. And therefore, why shouldn't this country have a categorical position with respect to conversion from its native faith systems to non-native faith systems? Why is that discussion such a politically incorrect, controversial topic to discuss? Why are believers and worshippers of free speech constantly trying to gag, stifle and silence this discussion? You seem to be comfortable discussing every possible thing under the sun, including the character of Sri Ram, the character of our deities, the sexual orientation of our deities. These were the questions raised with respect to Ayyappa's celibacy. How do you know for a fact that he is attracted only to women? These were the questions that were put to me, right? Now, when you think it's okay for you to ask these kind of questions, well, I should be at the very least allowed to ask this question, why can't I protect what is native to this land? Simple, right? So, perhaps one of the things that in my little way what I'm trying to do is to normalize controversial discussions and to make it possible to have a vocal conversation, a very clear, honest conversation on it with a very clear, let's say, rule. Don't cross lines of civility, use facts as much as possible and determine the rules of engagement here, but the topic will not be pixelated under any circumstances. So address the question of conversion in its entirety and ask yourself, what has been the experience of other colonized societies? How were Greece and Rome Christianized? And how their oracles and their priestesses were branded in the same way as Devadasis in our temples? And how these practices were completely taken out of context and distorted. Look at all that experience and you'll realize the same tried and tested template that's been applied across the world is being applied in Bharat. And the only reason that you don't know it is because you don't understand the global nature of this history. So, greater historical awareness, the confidence and the knowledge to articulate these positions perhaps will lead to some of these solutions. Thus far, I know for a fact that these FCRA regulations have done nothing on the ground. There are instances where some individuals in certain parts of the south are able to secure funds to the tune of 300 to 500 crores, individuals, not even organizations. 300 to 500 crores, and this is apparently after tightening FCRA regulations. Then I wonder what would have been the situation before and how much of money entered this country. Last question.
I think
from your perspective, this is left. I'll be told that I have a left bias. I'll take one question from there. Yes,
Sir.
please. Center, oh, fund. Please. Yes.
Using the wrong name of the student, are the implications different from same or and your views on gender ideology?
See, it's not as if the Kritiya Prakriti and the non-binary Prakriti is unknown to our worldview. We have had societies and temples dedicated to this, right? So I don't need to learn on non-binary gender identity from the West. That's exactly why I said you're following the path of the West even when it comes to this. Because pronouns are an imperative or let's say a critical discussion in the West, somehow Bharat, which is still dealing with basic issues, will now sit and discuss kaun se pronoun use kiye jayenge. This is the imposition of elite concerns on a still underdeveloped country. First submission. Second, assuming that you still want to insist that this discussion is very important in the context of Bharat, which has several issues to deal with, fine. I will say, I will not subscribe to anything that has come from United States or France unless I apply my Bharatiya filters to it, even in the context of pronouns. France itself is rejecting this garbage that is coming out of United States, saying we don't want this. Your humanities are the den of poison. We don't want that nonsense from United States. And therefore, I would only say, respect for gender identities and respect for non-conventional gender identities is not something where there can be any negotiation. I agree. I don't have a problem with that at all. I'm just hoping that this doesn't translate to weaponization of certain identities and policing of speech. On this, I will have very clear positions. Again, I am not from the Jordan Peterson school of thought. I'm making it very clear. Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, these are all people who come from a point of the supremacy of the Judeo-Abrahamic Western civilization. I don't. So my position doesn't draw from them. My position only says respect, sensitivity, and originality. That's it. Now, whatever this translates to. If someone comes and tells me in person, Mr. Sai Deepak, this is the pronoun with which I would prefer to be addressed, I'm not going to sit and fight with that person. Because I have Sai Deepak as a name. Someone calls me Deepak, I'd say Deepak is for people in the family. You call me only Sai, nothing else. If I get to say that, someone says, this is how I would prefer to be addressed, I don't have a problem. However, if the right of self-determination of gender translates to pixelation of certain biological realities and endangers others, I will apply the mischief rule there. I'll give you an example. In certain law schools in this country now, it has become a fad to have gender-free hostels, where apparently a boy identifies himself as a woman and lives with his girlfriend. Says, I will now simply use the power of self-determination to achieve my goals. Was this the purpose of self-determination? Is this how the argument was supposed to be in the first place? It was meant to protect a vulnerable group which is constantly found on traffic signals, which does not get employment because they're looked down upon, or they're pushed into human trafficking and the worst of activities possible because nobody else is willing to give them employment. Considerations which are meant to protect such vulnerable groups are now hijacked by the well-fed and the affluent. Tell me if this is not the textbook example of woke garbage. Of course it is. The elites appropriating a discussion which is meant to protect vulnerable people. I would say how shameless and insensitive of such people. How opportunist this is. So, I am not going to take a position which is different from the United States only because I don't want to take a position which is different from the United States. I have my very clear own independent reasons for having a different position. Protect vulnerable groups. Make sure that they're represented in public spaces. No problems. If I need a politician who's from the third gender versus a politician who's perhaps from the binary gender but who's corrupt, who will I go with? Their gender doesn't make a difference to me. Right? What is the traditional Indian approach to this or Bharatiya approach to this? Situation, circumstance, time, position, which is Desha, Kala, Samay. Don't approach any of these issues in vacuum. What is Dharma is never to be answered in vacuum without the boundary conditions being defined. Similarly, whether the use of a particular pronoun is right or wrong in a given context will be dependent on the context. Give me the situation, I'll give you a clearer answer. But in general, I'm going to say, I will not import first world considerations in a country which is still third world, unfortunately. And my considerations will be cultural in nature, will be rooted in my traditions and my philosophy. Period.
Thank you. I think we'll bring it close to the questions now. We're getting a lot of questions online also, but we'll, due to the paucity of time, I request Professor Sain and Shri Sai to make their closing remarks, if any, and please keep them brief.
Yeah, I was absolutely amazed by the depth and the plethora of this discussion which Sai was making, and I think it's dinner time in hostels. People are proceeding for the Annamaya Kosha. So I'll be quick. So what was visible in this wonderful, waves of discussion? See, we have a weakness and we had a weakness. We had a we had a fascination for the West, and it has been created by this, whatever you call this coloniality and the Aryan invasion myth and many other things. But if you look at the West right now, the West has more troubles than the East right now. The West has more troubles than the East. If you look at Europe, which Sai was saying again and again, there's a whole situation of decomposition. If you look at the Balkans, for example, the Balkan War, I think all of you know between 1991 and 1997, about 15 million people were killed in Eastern Europe, in the Balkan, Herzegovinian, Serbian war, which is almost like 1/3 of the Second World War. But the world did not notice because a certain group of the three Semitic religions was trying to get rid of another group of the Semitic religions in Eastern Europe. And today, the war that we see in Ukraine, is an extension of that war that we had in the 90s. And today, Europe has created its own grave. And it has created the whole linkage so bad, geopolitically so morbid and so weak, that the natural trade and the economic routes within and around Europe is automatically coming to a 0 point. And European products, European infrastructure are all almost outdated. If you go to most of the European cities, including the American cities, the problem of the Western economy today is not to build new infrastructure, but to maintain the old infrastructure that was made in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. If you go to New York City specifically right now, about 90% of the New York City bridges are outdated. And the Municipal Council of New York City is absolutely getting money from the surrounding states like New Jersey and all that. It's a reality. When I did my master's in the state of Iowa, the capital city of Des Moines had a homelessness of 16%, Sai. And today it has crossed 20%. Yeah, so it's comparable to the thresholds of a developing or an underdeveloped country. When you look at the visa situation right now, you know, the visas are being turned down to Europe and the US. Is it a political economic decision? No, there's so much of problem within those countries right now that the sweet romantic Europe and the industrially advanced America, where I was trained, I have to be grateful, cannot afford tourism or parents visiting their sons and daughters. So there are huge problems within the Western economy. Why? Because the West has created a civilization based on the reductionist approach. And everything is reduced to a full-scale growth and exploitation of the nature. And the whole ball game, you know, the tail of the serpent, you know, the mouth of the serpent was towards Asia, and the tail of the serpent was in the sky. But right now, the tail of the serpent is in Asia, and then the mouth of the serpent has returned back to the West. And if you look at the Western economy as such, there is a very powerful prediction by the WEF, which the West cannot afford, which says that by the year 2035, about 70% of the world economy will be mostly concentrated in the Asia Pacific, including South Asia. Can the West afford this? You know, if you see China, this is a live stream, if you see China as a devil's advocate, it is actually playing the role of an agency which cannot be played by others, not by a good Indian. It can be played by a very strong Chinese person. So it's creating the leaps and bounds in the global economy which the West could not conceive. You know, I'll just give you a simple example and I'll end there. Long back, Asia had a wisdom, and Europe transcended that by the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. Simple. And then the civilization crossed the Atlantic, reached New York, Chicago, and finally, when we are just getting out of college, The Bay Area was coming up. So if you look at the journey of civilization, it's very simple, and it's following the rays of the sun. It's crossing Asia, getting into Greece, Rome, Paris. Is Paris burning? And then a Titanic lifts Paris to rich New York. Everything leads to New York. In the 70s and the 80s, when I was a student at IIT Kharagpur, I saw most of the scholarships not coming from the eastern seaboard, but also coming from the Californian Silicon Valley. It was a rise of electronics industries. If you look at the 90s and the 2000 and the late 2000, the entire silicon industry has been transshipped to the Asia Pacific. There are more computers and more laptops and more iPhones which are actually controlled by the economies of the Asia Pacific. If you look at WHO specifically, the strictures and the dictums and the policies of WHO are more controlled by China and other Asian countries than they were controlled by the European and American monopoly decades back. So I cannot go like this. I think I've made my point clear. So what has happened, you don't have to solve the problem. The problem itself is solving the problem. Why? Because the West, for some reason, we are not against the West. I am trained in the West. Sai is trained in the West. But much of West has been so arrogant and so reductionist that the resources of exploitation with which it has exploited Asia has become the same forces with which it is getting self-exploited. And today, if you read Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West, and I'm just mentioning some books. If you read, which comes from a planning turf, it's a book called The Cities and the Wealth of Nations, written by Jane Jacobs. All these are all Western authors. They have said the history of the West is just 500 years. I'm coming back to where I started. The history of the West is just fall of Granada, 1492 to maybe 2192 maximum. Because the West could not build on the basic wisdom. It could not build its civilization on the first principles of civilization. It has always, please try to understand what I'm saying, it has always forged and manipulated and otherwise proved itself to be superior, which, if was corrected, the West could have been a large contributor of global civilization. So we don't have to worry about the West. The West is digging its own grave. But the problem which Sai said in the middle portion of his deliberation is that many of us educated Indians, including people in IIT Kharagpur, we are not aware of these things. We are not update. We are not aware of the latest Nobel Prizes, which runs in physics, 2022, which proves the ancient wisdom of interconnectedness of the universe, quantum entanglement. We are not aware of the Nobel Prize of 2017 in physiology, which has proved circadian rhythm, the ancient wisdom of pranayama, of the yoga, which has come within the purview of the West. So when a left-wing critic or a professor at IIT Kharagpur is criticizing Sai's book and my book without any fault or any remark, it's a problem of not being updated, because we are just updated with a 200 years old Newtonian, Cartesian, Francis Baconian, and a Sigmund Freudian, and a Charles Darwinian, and a Francis Galtonian version of science, which is vanishing from the face of the earth. And it's replaced by the ideas of Maslow, by the ideas of quantum electrodynamics of Richard Feynman, by the ideas of quantum nanochemistry of Ilya Prigogine, by the ideas of quantum physics by Alan Aspect, and by the ideas of Jeffrey Hall, which is the circadian rhythm, and many and many and many more. This is the new science which is rising in the West. which perfectly echoes and vibrates with the first principle of Indian ancient wisdom. So we are in crossroads. This is a golden age which is in the offing. So let us be very hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So one of my earliest conversations with Professor Sen when I was here in law school, and I think this was at his residence as part of the Vivekananda Study Circle. I don't know if sir remembers this. We were having a conversation on why don't we prove the historicity of the Mahabharata and the Vedas. That was my naive question at that point. Why don't we date it properly? Why don't we prove that we are the oldest? So sir's simple question was, why do we need to prove that? What are we looking at here? What is this competition here that you're trying to prove that you're the oldest? What difference does it make? Was that, let's say, where the Vedas compiled to prove that we are the oldest or the greatest? Or is the message of that particular compilation different from what you're making it to be? I've had that realization after a very long time. Because until then, I was 20 in here. By the time I left the place, I was 23. So I was like, no, we have to prove this, we have to prove this. The lawyer wanted to present the evidence, right? Now, today we live, fortunately, in an age where you have scholars like Vishwa Adluri and others, effectively saying the entire approach to Mahabharata and its dating and its historicity is so flawed because that reeks and smacks of Western frameworks being applied to Indic works. Now then the question from here is this then a fight between the let's say the West and the East? No, that's not the point being made here. Any philosophy, any position, any ideology, any opinion that pits itself against nature and cosmological balance, pits itself against time, and pits itself against, how do I put it, universal consciousness. So our entire fight is, you have been ravaging nature so much, your entire model is built on ravaging of nature so much, that if you think you alone are going to pay the price for it, no, all of us are going to pay the price for it, because as sir said, we are all interconnected. Nature is interconnected. Why is this conversation so important in an institution that is dedicated to the pursuit of science and technology? Because you are going to determine development and definitions of development and metrics of development and its impact on nature. You might come out with fantastic machines to drill and bore mountains, but will you have the vivek and the wisdom to ask, is this needed? What is its impact? Unless you ask that question, as a country which lives in or which is located in a biosensitive region, we will pay a huge price. So think of the IKS system as perhaps an attempt to reorient your compass towards Prakriti and towards nature without being Luddite in our position, which is to say we are not anti-development. We are just saying at the very least redefine and recast development, freeing it of its Western definitions, which are based on, as sir rightly points out, the Cartesian philosophy of placing man over nature, as opposed to man as part of nature. And the reason why I use man is not because I'm a misogynist, but because that philosophy places one particular gender at the top of the food chain. And it's not us who does it. So my only request would be, these are not the conversations of the well-fed and the pastime of the well-fed. These have very real implications for you in terms of policy making. If that basic dharmic compass and filter is absent in your decision-making policy, or let's say decision-making process, you might have created great cities. You would have created everything, which perhaps will not even last 500 years. And therefore, revisiting definitions of technology, development, all of this is absolutely crucial. Dharmic philosophies place a premium on Prakriti. Today, I think I was walking past the old building, the museum, and then the Hijli camp. And that portion, I think, on the other side of the old locomotive engine is so green. It's still so green with old trees. It is perhaps one of those meditative spots on the campus. Imagine what kind of civilization you have inherited, where you have cracked the code of the relationship between elevation of the consciousness and nature, that you choose not to make tourism spots out of Himalayas, and you choose to make them spots where you go for meditation and contemplation. And today, these are the very same places where you have 4-lane ways and 6-lane ways, and you have people going there in such droves, and you have commercialized the place so much. 3 consequences: energy sanctity, which you don't understand anymore, the consecrated space is out of the window. Along with that, natural balance is out of the window. It's a pain to go from Delhi to Shimla. I've said this so often. It's really a pain to go from Delhi to Shimla. The moment you go there and you see the garbage being piled on the sides. So this is how we have decided to define technology. We will use technology to address a problem that we have created, as opposed to asking how do we stop creating that problem in the first place. Because stopping the creation of the problem would mean putting a fetter on your consumption patterns, which means your bottom line is hit immediately, as an individual and as a company. I am not a card-carrying communist. I am not a leftist. At the same time, I don't need to subscribe to Western model of capitalism under any circumstances. I come back to the golden mean of Bharat. Strike a balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jisai. So,
I think this is a wonderful moment, and at a very personal level, I recall the day 1.5 decades back, Sai. I mean, sitting a very young, bright boy, and those years have passed, and India is emergent, and Bharat is refulgent, and it's absolutely bright. There are thousands and thousands of Sai, I think, who are sparkling in different corners of the country, of which this particular gentleman is one amongst many. And I think in the future, IIT Kharagpur and the IIT system and all the institutions of India, and why not of the whole world, will produce such humane, sensible beings. To make the change that you like to see outside, first change yourself. Physicians, heal thyself before you start healing others. Attanamakshatthaya, then jagadhitaya cha. Have you salvaged yourself? Has your conception changed? And then you change the environment. If you're doing that, that is the Bharatiya dot. That is the Bharatiya way. You may call it the Indian way, but it is the Bharatiya way as per JSD, J. Sai Deepak. A big hand. It's a very proud moment in my little life. A very proud moment. A very proud moment. Very proud moment. I mean, teaching becomes a pleasure, a delight, and finally a bliss. When it becomes a bliss, you just touch upon divinity, because it's truth, consciousness, and bliss. And when you can construct bliss in this planet, you design beauty, which is Sri. So God has 4 foundations: Sat, Chit, Ananda, Tatha, Sri. Till date, the 4th foundation of the first principle of Indology was not yet that highlighted. What Sai spoke is detailed, it went like an algorithm. His prescriptions, his details, his examples and instances. It's all about the beauty of the speech. It's like you're just not giving a whole landscape of the comment, but you're also detailing all your comments. So that's called Sri Vidya. That's called the beauty. So the biggest gift of Indian civilization to the whole world is to see the divine beauty not beyond the clouds, but right here on this planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So with this, so you just saw from Professor JS to JSD, and from JSD to DSP, and DSP to P. So Purushottam on my right and Digvijay Singh Punia here. We take your leave and we hand over to Sarthak for vote of thanks. Thank you guys. It was a wonderful session.
What an interactive session, sir. We have announcement for the following events which we will have in the further days. The event of Tribhaga, it is Rumination of Body in Indian Thoughts by Group Photo Editor of India Today, Bandeep Singh ji, on 6th December, Tuesday in the Maitri Hall. And then there's an event of Sarod by none other than legend Ustad Amjad Ali Khan on 8th December in Kalidas Auditorium. At last, I would like to thank respected Sai Deepak sir and our Joy Sen sir. At the same time, all the faculty members who are present here who have made this event successful. And lastly, all the participants who have came here and devoted their time for the knowledge. Thank you very much.
I mean, for book signing, I think book signing.
For the participants of the FDP, tomorrow there are no sessions, there are no lectures, but we are all assembling near the old building tomorrow at 10:15, and we'll be having a small visit of the IKS center and few galleries that we have prepared there. So tomorrow we are meeting at around 10:15 to maybe 11 o'clock. We'll have some samosa and tea together. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.